All right. We are here with a special guest today. Mr. Larry Thomas is in the house. Uh, Longtime seminar staff member, level 1, level 2 seminar staff, multiple affiliate owner, former college football player, did some athletic strength and conditioning before getting into CrossFit, and a diehard Oregon Ducks fan. So having about as good of a year as possible as far as that's concerned. Know that you just went to University of Michigan to watch the game, dude. What was that experience like?
Yeah, man, it was super fun. So, first of all, first time ever in the state of Michigan, overall. So, really looking forward to getting out there and see the sights. Went straight to Ann Arbor. It was fun seeing how confident Michigan fans are, regardless of the status of their team. But the Big House is a huge venue, super cool venue to see. Good backdrop, to the stadium and all that. So that was good. And then surprisingly a foodie town, man. A lot to eat out there. So I definitely had a good time with that. And that's
Heck yeah.
that's my
Yeah, man. That's awesome. That is so cool. Well, tell me a little bit about your coaching journey. So I mentioned it. You've been working for seminar staff. You've been uh, you own multiple affiliates. You've been in this
Mhm.
world for a little while. How'd you get into coaching in general? And then how did that lead you to CrossFit?
Yeah. I think typical, started out as an athlete, obviously. And so my education in college was in this kinesiology. And so it was always my intention to come out and be a strength coach, somewhere, whether that had been at like a high level university or something of that nature. So that was the start of my coaching journey. Got my CSCS first and spent,
Okay.
the first 4 years or so post college working in that industry before CrossFit became known to me and my bubble. Then I dabbled, for a little bit with CrossFit in the sense of I had friends that were doing it. So I was like, taking classes and just kind of doing the thing with them, but didn't really know what it was, didn't know anything about the methodology or anything like that. Um, and then when things weren't going, accordingly as far as climbing that ladder in the strength conditioning world, I saw this as an opportunity to kind of take a lateral step into another space where I'm still coaching and training, and things kind of snowballed from there. Um, as far as the gym ownership goes, which you mentioned, one of the two gyms that I own, I actually started out at. It was like the first gym that I started to coach at. So I went from part-time coach to full-time coach to head trainer to then owner before going and starting another gym of my own. So that's kind of what that journey looks like.
That's awesome. So starting with like strength and conditioning, athletic strength and conditioning type stuff, what was the biggest difference in coaching at a CrossFit affiliate compared to working with athletes? I'm assuming younger athletes more
Yep.
often than not, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest difference is just the focus of the program. A lot of sports specific training. So working with basketball players, for example, and a lot of emphasis on their ability to get a vertical leap and to be able to rebound from that. And a lot of prehab stuff, like trying to avoid and reduce the risk of injuries around the knees and the ankles with how much they run and jump. And baseball players, a lot of rotational action for them swinging. So trying to do like anti-rotation work to balance them out and make sure that they're stable through the core. So it's very focused on the skills and, the movement patterns of the individual based on the sport and position that they played. Whereas CrossFit is obviously GPP. So there's a little bit of everything for everybody. So
Yeah.
definitely had to broaden my scope as a coach in terms of my ability to see across different movements and learn different ways to cue and correct them across a much broader, selection of movements and skills compared to what I was doing when I was a strength coach.
So tell me how does it compare? Do you like working with the everyday athlete more than more than like sport specific athletes, or still miss that? Where's your
I,
head at?
yeah, I definitely miss training athletes just from the sense of the motivation's different for them. Like they have a specific thing, they're trying to accomplish. Not that, the gym members in CrossFit don't, but, they're trying to excel and be the best at their position specifically. And they're trying to accomplish the goal of winning, their high school championship or whatever that thing is. Right. And so there's a lot of like association with that outcome and the level of intensity that they bring to their training. And it's always fun to kind of see that play out like in the sessions. and again, I just resonated, being a former athlete, like it just gets me going as well, right? Like in the sense of like I get pumped up and I get motivated by it. So that being said, when I'm at the gym, at the affiliate, if I can capture any sense of that from like my general everyday people, finding something that they're really excited about and motivated about, and seeing them get that same kind of little fire lit, like that's when, I'm having the most fun in the gym. And I think they are as well. So just trying to find that like athletic tie for someone who like may have never been an athlete before in their life, right? And like now this muscle up like is their game day, and like how do we get them there? So that's kind of how I like,
Bridge the
level
gap.
out those feelings. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I always found that, like, especially working with young athletes, the ones that wanted to be there and really were eager to get better, I loved working with them.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, that wasn't always the case. Some of them had to be there, and that was just not enjoyable for me. So usually, like in an affiliate, everybody that's there is paying good money to be there. They want to be there, and whether their like athletic goals are the same or not, they are eager and willing for the coaching and the feedback. And so that's always motivated me more. It's like I love working with young athletes if they want to be there. If not, no thanks.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I noticed we got James on. He said, "Good morning, James. What's up? I know you work with Olympic lifters and also coach regular classes. I'd be curious to know if you have any thoughts on that, James. Do you like, and anybody watching or listening, do you like coaching the general population, or if you have any specific classes that you coach, Olympic lifting or gymnastics, do you like that stuff more so?" Larry, I'd be curious to know, like, as you've continued to kind of develop as a CrossFit coach, what skills do you think have served you well in like a class setting? Is there anything specific that's different, obviously, than that the one-on-one stuff? You kind of made mention of the specific type of training that you did with athletes, but I think working in those small groups or working with athletes or working with that one-on-one is a lot different than a class of 10, 12, 15 people. So what's some of the skill sets that you've had to develop in order to be an effective in that environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think right off the top of my head, like the big one is like the soft skills, right? Like the personality stuff, the ability to be kind of a butterfly in the sense as I describe it, and adapt to whom is in front of me and what what kind of energy, what kind of personality they need to keep them motivated and engaged. I leveraged that early on in my career in the strength space. Just being an athlete, being confident, being in front of people, being vocal, right? Like that lent itself to me being able to, command a room when it was my opportunity to lead and really get people going. And so I was able to kind of carry that along. And now that I'm in a space where, like you mentioned, we are getting into like these subgroups of people within the community, that presence and attitude isn't the same across each of those opportunities. Really specific example is we just started a Legends program at my gym, in the past few months, and these folks are all, pushing 80. And so just socially, obviously the conversation is different with those folks. Like they're not talking about the Celtics game last night. Like they're talking about, how they're spending their retirement. They're going bird watching and doing hikes and things. But like me at 35, in a couple of weeks, 34 now, 35 soon to be, I can still come in and interact with that group in a very meaningful way that makes them feel like I'm one of them. And it doesn't seem like, oh, we got this young whippersnapper, here trying to lead this Legends class. And so just having the social awareness to tailor that experience personally to the people that you're working with helps to be successful across those different programs. And it lends itself to how you lead those classes. If it is a specialty class like weightlifting, for example, figuring out how these people are motivated and what they're there to do, and showing up as that person for that class gets the most out of that time spent in that specific setting. So.
Yeah, I love that concept. And I think not only is that huge for coaches to be able to be a butterfly and connect, but I think that's one of the best parts about being in a CrossFit affiliate. And I see we've got Steven here saying what's up. Let me see what he said here. As an ex-athlete as well, I love working with anyone that wants to improve. Hell yeah, that's what we were saying there. Athlete or not, it's hard to get people motivated if you're wanting it more than them. Yeah, you've got to figure out how to motivate them to do so. And usually when people are in the CrossFit gym, they're motivated for something, right? Losing weight,
Mhm.
getting healthier, getting
Yep.
stronger, whatever that is. And where I was going with that is like one of the coolest things about a class, whether it's a master's program or not, like if it's a master's program, that's unique because it's a smaller demographic and they all have things in common. But I love the fact that on any given class, you can probably have, depending on how young you let people into your regular classes, you can have
Mhm.
somebody that's maybe 16 or 17 years old up to 50, 60, 70 years old and everything in between. And then you've got people that have all kinds of life experiences and things like that. And to see like kids that are 16 have something to relate to with a 60-year-old or the
Mhm.
30-year-old, CEO, or, the person that's a surgeon or something like that, the amount of confidence that those kids start to develop and their ability to relate to others. I know that was something that I struggled with as a younger kid. And as you start to grow up and get different jobs and things like that, it's like, wow, I don't have anything in common with these older people. How do I
Right.
come up with small talk and things like that? And so, like I said, not only is that a cool skill set for a coach, but just that's what happens in the gym. You've got
Mm.
all different ages and experiences, and they've got one common bond, which is the suffering that happens in the workout.
Yep.
And you've got something to talk about, which is really, really cool. I love to see just the development as human beings when they're
Sure.
in the CrossFit gym.
For sure.
Now, what's interesting about that is you make mention of essentially the presence and attitude and how that's one of the biggest things you worked on developing. One of the places I want to go on this discussion was some of the skills that we develop at the level 2 course and what we cover at the level 2 course. And although we touch on presence and attitude, and we know that that's a big part of our coaching, oftentimes newer coaches, the things they struggle with is like seeing and correcting. And so that's what we really dive into when we're teaching level 2 courses and running through drills there. Really what I've experienced is you kind of don't become a CrossFit coach if you don't have a strong presence and attitude. Now there are objective ways to improve that, but it's
Mhm.
usually if you get asked to coach or you want to coach, it's because you want to help serve people and things like that. Um, and so when it comes to level 2 and when it comes to seeing and correcting, before I watch this little video that CrossFit Training put out, I'd be curious to know from you, what are some of the tricks of the trade that has helped you with your seeing and correcting through the years, like as you've continued to develop as a coach?
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a great question. Um, Early on, it started with like videos online. There's no way around getting reps, right? And there's not necessarily always the best case scenario of like being in the gym and having someone in front of you. Asking my wife to grab the broomstick doesn't always work, So,
Yeah.
going to YouTube channel, going to CrossFit's YouTube channel and just like watching videos and I would strategically like mute the video and just try to like analyze on my own what I was seeing and then, kind of play it back with sound and see if they were, highlighting the same faults or giving the same cues and corrections that I was thinking for myself. And that was kind of like my way of getting extra reps and like helping to train my eyes. And then from there, like in the gym setting, again, just as much as I could, one, learn from as many people as possible, right? Like, so, talking to everybody who would listen to me, ask them questions about this stuff. But just putting myself in a position where I could go and just kind of be a fly on the wall. And again, just kind of get those reps because there's no way around it. So just training the eyes, watching, attending classes that I wasn't a participant in so that I could pay full attention versus, being in the middle of the wall, but also trying to like peek around at what the coach is doing, right? Like
Yeah.
there's different outcomes to each of those scenarios. And the former, I spent a lot of time doing to really be able to dial in and take notes and do the things that needed to happen for me to grow in that way.
Yeah. That's so cool. Um, it's one of the coolest opportunities we have as seminar staff members. I can remember when I first got on staff that I
Yep.
just grilled everybody that I worked with on all the faults I couldn't
Yeah.
fix. I would be like, hey, when you've got somebody that doesn't open their hips in the push jerk, like, what do you do? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
well, what if that doesn't work? What's next? All right, well, it's
Yeah.
crazy the access and the resources that we have, and not everybody gets that
Right.
opportunity to ask those questions. Um, and I love your point about finding reps, even if that ends up being online. Um, I think I was fortunate enough to get into CrossFit early enough and start coaching early enough that the reps came as the entire program and coaching in general was kind of developing, because there wasn't a ton of videos online about movement. Not everybody really knew movement all that well, what the coaching process was supposed to look like. And I was kind of able to figure it out as I went. Now, unfortunately, I made a lot of mistakes along the way. I'm sure you were able to streamline and not quite have as many of those, which is cool. But one of the things that we're doing at Best Hour is trying to expedite that process for other coaches. We've got things like the knowledge where people can come and learn from a cohort of people that want to be better, watch videos, discuss what we're looking at, see cues and corrections. Like the Knowledge and the Knowledge Pro are great resources for that. When you're watching videos, like, how did you even know what to look for as far as like faults and things like that?
Yeah. So you brought up a good point, right? Like not knowing, or knowing what you don't know was the starting place for me. So, for example, getting on staff and coaching a push press, for example, and I could see all the obvious things, right? Like, the vertical torso and all that. But when it came down to like a subtle weight shift forward, I was missing those types of things. And it wasn't until I had the benefit of someone else bringing it to my attention, like Denise would be like, hey, you're missing that, look. And I'm like, how do you even see that? Like, I can't see that. But now I'm aware that that's something I'm missing. So now that's my focus. I'm hawk-eyed, I'm zeroed, and I'm locked in on that one specific thing until I've like felt comfortable that I can identify it, more regularly and more rapidly. And so what I would do is I created like a little web in my notebook, right? And so like, let's say I was missing forward inclination of the torso, right, in the push press. So I'd write that down, and then I would try to find as many resources as I could associated with that one specific fault. And I would basically just create this library of resources for myself based on things that I identified as like holes in my game. And that was kind of how I like created this whole little system for myself to grow kind of like one step at a time in all these different areas.
Yeah, so it's like, hey, I'm gonna memorize the points of performance. I'm gonna write those things down, and then I'm gonna think through all the different ways that they can go wrong, what that potentially looks like, and then figure out ideas on how to fix that going forward. I remember at one point, I can't remember where this was at on my seminar staff journey, but I was working with Joe Alexander, and it was probably when I was getting into the level 2 and I was coaching groups in front of all the participants and also the other trainers that were giving us feedback. And he gave me this analogy. He's like, when you're doing this now, like you're so focused on those big points of performance or those little things that it's like you're looking through a straw. It's like I can only see the vertical torso because I'm not familiar enough with it and not good at seeing it enough to like have resources go anywhere else. It's like the more time you spend in this and the better you get at really understanding what a vertical torso should look like. Now I'm no longer looking through a straw. Now it gets a little bit bigger. And so now it's like, that's easier to see. And I can use a little bit more of my mental resources to see if somebody's shifting forward onto their toes or if the early press starts to happen or something like that. So I think to your point, it's like, we've got to start with that one place, really focus on that, figure that out, get so comfortable with that that's no longer challenging to see or to correct or whatever. And then that gives us and frees up more mental resources to look at other things and to hopefully identify and start to find some other stuff. Now, CrossFit Training just released a really cool video on their YouTube page just the other day, a day or two ago, and it was about what was learned on what you learn at a level 2. And I want to play a little bit of this because I think it's pretty cool, and I'm going to ask some questions about it.
Yeah. I was working with Denny. One of the main things I was working on was...
I've got it sped up a little bit. Let me slow it down to where it's not quite as fast.
What I see as I'm coaching a group. I really had to work on when people are in static holds, holding a position on the push press in their dip or overhead at scanning the group.
Based off of what you told me you want to work on is the macro, micro, macro. So right now, I would love to see you scan the group and either give positive feedback on a setup position so that I know you're looking, or correct a static position. Then watch one person, keep that cataloged, and then you're going to scan the group at the finish position.
Okay.
And you're either going to give feedback or correct.
Okay.
And then we'll come back to the dynamic.
So that concept right there of like you can either say macro, micro, macro. We, in some of our lessons at Affiliate University or Coach Development, our program there, and in the knowledge, we'll term it like a 2-1-2, where we're looking for two people in the static position that we want to cue or correct or give praise to. We're going to watch one, just as Jenny pointed out right there. We're going to watch one person when they're moving dynamically, and then try to scan the group in that setup or in that finish or receiving position to give one or two more corrections. That's such a cool approach because it allows us to do so much. Number one, if I'm able to give 2 cues in the setup, watch one person move dynamically, and then give 2 more cues in that finish position, I've just given like 5 cues in a single rep. Potentially those all go to different athletes. So now I've interacted with and improved movement for 5 people in a single rep. And that's huge when it comes to trying to coach larger classes. It also allows me to keep the group more engaged. I don't know if you've noticed this before, Larry, but if I'm like, hey, Larry, elbows up, like not only will you push your elbows up, but everybody will do it. Mm-hmm. If all of a sudden I just go, hey guys, remember elbows up, for whatever reason, almost nobody does it. It's like when I use somebody's name and I'm talking to one person, everybody does it. When I'm talking to everybody, almost nobody does it. So by using those static positions and giving more cues and corrections, everybody's working a little bit harder for me and staying engaged throughout. I'd love to hear some of your pointers and your thoughts around just that concept of like micro, macro, micro.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I'm pretty much in line with, what Jenny just described there, and also how you use it. I think we're all kind of in the same boat with that. One of the biggest benefits from this, as you just mentioned, is it helps it helps coaches get away from what we call empty reps, right? Just calling repetitions, saying go, 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 and the athletes have done 5 reps of the movement, but there's no feedback, there's no interaction, there's no engagement. So it definitely helps to tackle that and makes the coach much more effective. Now, here is the challenge with this 2-1-2 drill, though, that I see, and the way to enhance it. It's a useful tool if used effectively. When we get to that scanning, coaches don't necessarily always know what they're looking for. So sometimes that turns into wandering, right? And so the way that I do this is that I will specifically guide them in terms of like, when you're scanning, what exactly are you looking for? Where are you looking on the athlete? Where are you standing as the coach, so that they're more focused and they see something intentional in that time versus just having the eyes wander for the sake of wandering. And then that allows us to get a lot more out of this drill and make it much more effective for both the athletes and the coach.
Heck yeah. And we've got our guy, Zach, calling you out. I'm with you. My man, Larry, as well, dude. We love having him on. Yes, I love that point. And here's the deal is like, whenever when we challenge people to do this drill, like to try to start adding some of those cues, they spend so much time like searching for something like gross, like a big fault or an obvious fault. They spend so much time doing that they end up holding their athletes in a static position for like, what feels like 5 minutes, but it's probably like 30 seconds, which ultimately more often than not is too long. So I love the fact that you pointed out that you usually guide them. And I'd be curious to know, like, especially with this movement right here, the athletes are doing a push press. This is them in the finish position. Where are you guiding that coach? If you're Jenny in this scenario and you're talking through and you're guiding, where should eyes go? Like, what are you doing for this finish position for the push press?
Yeah, exactly. So the way that I would do it is before the athletes move, I'm going to say, hey, give me one thing that you're looking for in a static position. And they'll say, elbows slightly in front of the bar or whatever they want to point out. I'm saying, okay, now dynamically, while they're moving, what's one thing you want to look for? And they'll say, vertical torso or whatever it is, like hip extension, timing and press, whatever. So then I ask the question of, okay, if we're looking for vertical torso, what specific body part, where are you looking on the athlete? And they're going to say, I'm looking at the shoulder or the edge of the PVC pipe or whatever. So, all right, we're about to call these few reps. In the setup position, you're going to watch the elbows, and you're going to watch the elbows only to see that they're slightly in front of the bar, because that's what you highlighted was your focus for the setup.
Yep.
We're going to look at Jenny and Susie here, these two in the back. But then when you call the rep, we're only going to look at Jenny, and we're going to watch Jenny's shoulder to see if that shoulder leans or stays vertical while she goes. And then I would just repeat that process, right? If we're addressing the finish position, what's the one thing that you're looking for in the overhead? All right, now when they finish this rep, we're going to hold them there, and that's where your eyes go. Or we're looking at the elbow or whatever the thing is. And so that's kind of the process that helps kind of lead them to that.
Yeah, I think that's great. It's like, get them to have that checklist of points of performance in their mind and be proactively looking for it rather than reactive and trying to figure it out. And so if you know what you're going to be looking for before you even call the rep and before you even use the progression and start teaching the session, it's going to make your job way easier.
Yeah.
Now, an additional thing, and I think this comes with more experience, it's like step one is going to be knowing the points of performance, right? Step two is going to be able to identify whether the points of performance are being executed or not, and like coaching one person at a time, much less giving multiple cues and corrections. But once you get to the point where you're ready for this concept, the micro or the macro concept, just like you said, knowing those points of performance and thinking through those and letting that be the default thing that you look at, I think is going to be huge. Now, as you continue to evolve, I think there's a couple other layers that you can start to add to this thing that's going to make the job easier. One of those being, if you can start to memorize the cues and corrections or the tendencies that your athletes have, you're now going to be able to correct those without necessarily even looking at it. So to your point, if like Larry, if you're an athlete in my class and I know that the front rack position for you in any of our pressing movements is a little sticky and it's a little tough, and your tendency is to have your elbows behind the bar, before even class starts or as soon as we even start, I don't even need to look at you. I can just be like, I know Larry's tendencies to have his elbows back. And so the first cue I'm going to give is like elbows forward, Larry, or Larry elbows forward, right? So that can be something that I remember of you as a mover because you're a member of my athlete, or I can see that in you in the very first rep and then be like, all right, Larry's my guy. I'm going to check back in on and repeat that Q2 as we go. So I think that's one thing, is trying to memorize our athletes' patterns and their habits, and that'll make it easier. Another one is starting to peel back the layers of the points of performance and not only think what are the points of performance for the movement, but then based on my experience coaching, what are the points of performance that typically go wrong in this movement or this phase of the movement? And I'd be curious to know, is that something that you think about, is like, hey, what are the things that are usually done incorrectly? And let's go to the video that we see right here. We see everybody in this overhead position.
Yeah.
What are the things that people like, what is the probably number one thing? And maybe like there's probably a primary thing from my experience, and then a secondary thing in this position that we see these athletes in. What's the primary thing that goes wrong in this position? Most athletes, most of the time.
Two things come to mind for me. One is like full range of motion. So like that bar gets left out in front, right? Like, and then the other is that those ribs start popping out, right? Like as they press overhead. So
yeah. And if you look right in front of us, we can see that we're a little bit overextended right here with the athlete right there. I'm trying to look. It looks like her bar might be a hair forward and maybe hers as well.
Yeah.
We see the gal in the back here a little bit overextended to where we could give that cue. And so now all of a sudden, like to your point, instead of having to spend my resources, like really starting to look, is there anybody that really looks overextended? No, I'm just going to know that that's the thing that probably goes wrong more often than not. And so I'm just going to try to memorize somebody's name. And then I may be like, hey, Susie, pull your ribs down, or squeeze your belly, or squeeze your butt, or whatever that ends up being, which is really, really cool and makes this job a little bit easier. Yeah. And I think we can apply that same concept to each phase of the movement. For example, when it comes to the dynamic, we've got 3 main points of performance in the push press: torso position, speed, and then timing. Out of those 3, what's the primary one that typically goes wrong from your experience?
Yeah, just that torso position. Some sort of forward inclination. Yeah.
Heck yeah. And so it's like, that's going to be the main thing that I'm looking for when people are moving. When I say go, it's going to make my job a little bit easier right there. So I love that concept with this thing. Now, I want to play a little bit more of this because she continues with this concept, but then she starts helping him with his eye. And as far as the most challenging thing to see with the push press, from my experience, it's the timing. Would you agree with that? Yeah, it's super challenging. So let's see. We're going to watch a little bit more here.
Lisa, pull your ribs down.
Yep.
Good.
And just to our point, right? She's the one that we noticed right off the bat that was the most obvious with the overextension.
And reset.
But when someone moves, focusing in on one specific person or even body part of someone.
Go.
That's that idea of like, hey, with the micro, we've got to be focused in the dynamic phase. When they're moving, there's got to be one person that we're looking at, and more specifically, one point of performance with that person. Let's see. I'm going to scoot up just a little bit to where we get to the timing piece that we talk about. All right. I think it's right about here.
You press. And reset.
It's right before that. All right, let's see.
He was timing, locking out legs before pressing.
And go. Back to next rep. I want you to be more aggressive. I want you to squeeze your legs as hard as you can before you press. And reset. And go. Better. Good. Need to be more aggressive. Reset.
Jenny taught a few different ways to help see it and then really show the difference of what an early press looks like versus the correct technique. So being able to see the difference from her, and one of the tips she gave was to look past the athlete so that they're in your peripheral.
Look at me and keep her in your peripheral.
Okay.
Don't look.
All right. So I'm curious. I've heard this a lot, right? Of like, hey, instead of focusing specifically on the athlete, kind of look at something in the distance and you'll kind of catch it out of the corner of your eye. Is that what you do when it comes to like trying to see timing, or how do you go about trying to see timing? Because I think this is one of the hardest faults to see.
Yeah, it's tough. So the preface that I use is that not everyone's going to be able to see this the same way. And so you got to find the best way for you as a coach to see it. Like what works for me might not work for you. So I'll start with like the hip, like you watch the hip, like was that all the way open? And then they'll be like, they'll see it, but they can't quite see that in the bar. So they're not really sure. So then I'm like, okay, now let's watch the barbell, right? Like when they stand up, tell me if the bar is moving while they're standing, right? And so that may get a little bit closer for someone. And then if the bar is tough to watch, I pick the body part. So look at the elbows. Like the elbows will extend when they press the bar. So are those elbows moving? So like I try to find different spots that are associated with the timing that could be a good viewpoint for that individual. And then that changes person to person. And someone might be like, oh man, elbows really showed it. I really saw it with that. Hips, I didn't see it at all. And someone might be like, hips was really obvious. I don't know what you mean when you tell me to watch the bar, right? So I think it's kind of case by case as well in that regard.
Yeah, I love that. It's like the more body parts that you can point them towards and the more specific things to look at, the easier it's going to become. And because the interesting thing too is not every athlete, but you might have multiple athletes with the same fault, but it's displayed a slightly different way. And so you're going to see it from a different angle, or a different body part is the tell on that specific thing. And so I like your point there. I know a lot of oftentimes specifically with this fault of the timing, I'll try to make a mental image of where the bar is at as your athlete's stationary and standing. And I'm like, all right, I need the bar to get back to that imaginary line before we go ahead and press overhead, or before it starts to move. I think that can help me sometimes, to your point, watching the elbows and seeing if they start to move. Typically, I see the elbows when someone's going to be pressing early. The elbows actually drop down to start with in the dip, and then they're already moving before they start going up. And it's that's a good example there. I think she does a really cool drill here. I'm going to play this. She does some demonstration. She helps these guys see. Let's take a look at this real quick.
Look at her.
Okay.
Do 3 reps.
Okay.
And wait till you see one that looks like everything's going in one instead of.
Okay. And go. Okay.
You see it? Okay, do another one.
Reset. And go. Yeah. Okay.
And you can really clearly see the difference of timing when someone presses early versus when someone does it in sequential order.
Reset. Okay, I want you to feel your glutes squeeze and your quads squeeze before you press. So your knees lock out, then go. And go.
All right. See how that looks a little bit different?
Yeah.
Okay, relax.
Okay.
All right, I think she's about to show one here. It's cool that Jenny's really driving home, like stay with that athlete, keep watching until you feel comfortable with that. This is one of these things. I was on a call yesterday with our coach development group, and this exact fault was coming up, and they're like, I wasn't sure. If you've ever got a coach that's like, hey, I couldn't tell, I wasn't sure, what do you tell that coach? Is it probably good or probably bad?
Yeah, I was like, you're probably on to something. Like, you should ask for more. Yeah, for sure.
Yes. It's like that spider
It's like-
sense.
it's
If you
like-
feel it in your stomach,
it's either a definite yes or it's not. Like, it's like,
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things of like, it's either a hell yeah or a no, right?
Mhm.
All right. Let me look real quick again. Let's see what we got here.
So really real quick.
Q really helped and has helped me see early pressing in a lot of athletes, even since my level 2 a week and a half ago.
Check this out. I'm going to show you.
Now we're going to thing. All right. So with this, I'm going to pull this thing off. Now, here's the deal. We see the fault. Somebody's pressing early. What's your approach? How do you fix this thing? What's your go-to cue to fix this?
So I start with trying to control the speed of the movement. So I might actually try to get them to say, hey, do you squeeze your butt before you press, right? Like, that's like a quick, easy cue that hopefully addresses the timing of those two things happening. But when that doesn't work, and I see it in the case of the athlete just moving too quick, that their body just can't connect those things. So by slowing them down a little bit and helping them build some awareness of what that extension before press feels like is usually successful for me. But again, obviously there's a lot of different ways to go about that. But the low hanging fruit, squeeze your butt before you press, and then address the tempo of the movement. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting. In further along in the video, he shows, and especially back at his gym, where he'll slow the athlete down a little bit, and it almost turns into two separate movements. And I know I've done that exact same thing. It's like, I want my athlete to feel the sequence more than I want them to worry about the speed. And oftentimes when we do something like that at a level 2, somebody's like, yeah, but that's not how the movement should be. And you're like, you're absolutely right. But guess what the easiest thing to add to any movement is?
Speed.
Yeah. It's like, hey, all right, Larry, that's it. Now go faster. Everybody's willing and ready to do that. The other thing that I think sometimes we as coaches don't realize is that even if we're using a PVC pipe, moving at speed is still moving with intensity. And if you go back to our charter, mechanics, consistency, intensity, it's like sometimes we need to remove the intensity, the speed in this case, working on the mechanics and the consistency before we speed them back up. So not being afraid to do that if that's the case, especially in a teaching session, a specific warm-up or something like that. I don't know that I'm going to stop somebody in the middle of a workout and turn it into two movements, right? But teaching session for sure, I'm doing that. Since we're talking about the push press, another thing that I'm curious about, and you made mention, is the most obvious fault with the push press in the dynamic phase is going to be the torso position. It's one thing to see the fault. It's another thing to know why it's actually happening. How do you go about, number one, for you as a coach, knowing the difference? And then number two, how do you help newer coaches when you're at a level 2 to figure out not only what's going on, but why it's actually going on?
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think we already touched on it a little bit with that demonstration in the video from Jenny. This is where I actually use that look in the distant cue, because if I set up directly parallel beside my athlete, and now I don't look at them, I look through them. I look through the shoulder, right, across the room, and I just keep that line of sight. As I say go, I can easily tell if they deviate away from my line of sight at all. So like now I've been able to identify that torso lean, and that helps a ton. Now I need to understand body positions associated with the movement. And what I mean by that is, to your point, like it could be a number of reasons. One, going too low in dip could create more of a forward inclination because it becomes more of a squatty motion, right? And so people don't always identify that. And I might just tell someone, hey, just go a little less deep, and that torso's fixed, right? And then there's the obvious low-hanging fruit of like, hey, they pushed their butt back too much, the knee shot forward, right? Like, so like those things. So like it's kind of like a little bit of, whack-a-mole in terms of your approach and vision for it.
Yeah, right. And that's what those two are the two most common. And then there's also one where somebody initiates correctly with their knees going forward and out, their hips sinking straight down, and they're just lazy and they either let their elbows or their chest slightly drop. What's always interesting and what's challenging, I think, for coaches is like, to your point, they're looking in the distance. And I don't think I've ever tried that way, but I love that concept of like looking through and see if they deviate from my line of sight. But people will see the torso come forward and they're like, all right, I've identified it. It's a fault. Their chest is coming forward. All right, on the next one, chest up or elbows up. And you're like, well, if you luck out and you've got the one person that's just leaning forward as they go, that's going to fix them. But unfortunately, if you've got the athlete, to your point, that's initiating by pushing their butt back, no amount of chest up or elbows up is ever going to fix that. It might get them really like overextended and their chest is a little bit more upright, but it's not going to fix the root cause. And it's one of those things where I just feel like more time under tension and more understanding of not only what the points of performance are, not what the fault looks like, but why it's happening, and like going through the troubleshooting process of, hey, I tried chest up or elbows up, didn't work. Why not? Like, it should work. Why not?
And I think something that goes with that we mention but don't, make it obvious, is like there's an extra rep in there. Like what I said was I called the rep and identified that they were leaning forward. I then didn't go right into a cue. I watched another rep to see that, it's because they're squatting too low. Now I'm more prepared to deliver an effective cue versus just spatting out things at the first sight, So I think that's part of it too.
Yeah. And I think that's huge of like, and this kind of goes back to the pre-work that you talked about, where it's like you sit and write down and think through your lesson plan. And it's not only what are the points of performance? Now, what are the points of performance that are most likely to go wrong? How are they most likely to go wrong? And like, what are the root causes of those things? And unfortunately, there's a lot of that stuff where it's like, I wish I could just tell a new coach all of these different things that I know and I've learned through, 15 years of coaching, thousands of people. But unfortunately, like there's reps that have to be had. And to your point, like you talked about at the beginning of this thing, is like sometimes we're not going to be able to get the quantity of reps by simply coaching. And so thankfully, there's so many more resources now. There's videos on any social media channel where if you just picked and like searched a movement, anything that you struggle with or that you want to see more of, like what's going to come up is probably thousands of people doing that movement. And there's going to be some that are really, really good. There's going to be some that are really, really bad. And you have the ability to start watching those and figure out the difference between the two, but you've got to take the initiative to do so.
For sure.
That's cool. Just for this concept of that same like macro, macro, we've already talked about the pressing series, like the macro, looking at like elbow position in the setup, looking at overextension in the setup, and probably where the bar is resting are like the three main things I'm looking at. You talked about in the finish overhead position, overextension of the spine and the bar not being over the midfoot because of range of motion issues. What are some of the main things that you're looking for in other movement series? Let's go to like the deadlift series. In the setup position for the deadlift, that first macro, where is your eyes defaulting to? What are you looking for primarily to identify things to correct in the setup of the deadlift?
Yeah. Two things jump out at me. One, just that balance about the foot. So making sure that people aren't like shifting into the toes in the setup. And then two, that relationship between the hips and shoulders, like all those shoulders slightly over the bar, right? Like that's a big one. And you can make a ton of corrections around that, like in the setup.
And where do people tend to set up with that? Are they way too far over the bar or way behind the bar? Like, and how does that like manifest?
Yeah. So I'm usually getting people to that, like their hips are too low, right? Like they sit where their hips are low and their shoulders are like either over or behind the bar, right? So I'm always making that correction there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one, like, if I've got a class of 10 new athletes that I've never seen before, I'm pretty confident that probably 8 out of 10 are going to squat or are going to set up in a squatty setup.
Yeah.
And it's like, have you ever thought why you think that happens? Like, I don't know that I'm right, but I've got two hypotheses as to why people do that. Like have a low hip squatty setup for the deadlift. Have you ever thought about that? Why people default to that?
Yeah, I have thought about it. I don't know if we're on the same page with that, but like one thing is it's more comfortable and familiar with them based on like their current movement pattern. And then like just like like the people are just like used to like hinging at the knee as opposed to the hip. Like, and so like they just default to that, right? Like they're more quad dominant. Like, yeah.
Yeah, right. It's like people don't feel everything we do on a day-to-day basis, we're kind of on the balls of our feet and we're probably using more of our quads than our hamstrings and glutes. And so I think to your point of like when people lift their hips up and they feel it in their hamstrings and their butt and they're not used to this, they're like, wait a second, this doesn't feel right. Let me drop my butt and get to where I'm used to, which are my quads. And then to your point, like bending their knees more. From my experience, and it's probably less true now than it was many years ago, but like when I was starting CrossFit, I think number one, most people had just worked out at a traditional gym and rarely had people done any like leg stuff. But if they had, it was probably like squats more so, or stiff-legged deadlifts than traditional deadlifts. And so in my mind, I was like, all right, when people are starting this, they look at the deadlift and they're like, well, it's a leg exercise, but instead of the bar being on the back, it's on the ground. So I probably approach it like a squat, but I just grab the bar in front of me. And so if you approach it like a squat, your butt's going to be too low, right? Because we've always heard that adage of lift with your legs, not your back. When in reality, you actually have to lift with your back a little bit. So yeah, I'm with you. The hip position, the balance about the foot, I think those things are too tight, like kind of tied together too. And then a lot of times of like just simply pulling your shoulders back, which will it's kind of a twofold active shoulder position and then also like a neutral spine. Those can kind of work together. So in the execution of the deadlift, in the dynamic phase of the deadlift, what do you expect to see go wrong? Like what happens more often than not?
Yeah. So the action of the knees on that initial pull off the ground, right? Like the knees have to move back to allow the bar to travel in a straight line. And often we see that get violated in some way. And I've actually seen you break this down in a video online. And, it could address bar path, if the knees stay in place and the bar travels out and around. It could also affect that relationship of the hips and shoulders rising together, right? Which ultimately lends itself to that bar path and the athlete being able to keep the bar close. So like the knee is a big one that I address kind of right away. And you see it, both on the initiation of the deadlift and also the return as well.
Heck yeah. It's like, the bar is going to go around the knees. That's like, if something's going to go wrong in the execution of the lift, it's the bar going around the knees, either on the way up or the way down. And to your point, that's either because they're not moving their hips and shoulders together at the same time. If we've not fixed that setup position and they're too squatty, that could be it. If they're quad dominant and they're afraid of those hamstrings on the way down, they're going to jam those knees forward. So I'm with you there. That's awesome. Looks like we got AAA. We got Craig in the house. What's up, guys? Sumo deadlift high pull. What goes wrong there more often than not?
Yeah. That early arm pull, man. That's
dude, 100%, right?
Yeah.
How do you see that? Like we spend a lot of time like talking through the timing in the push press. How do you see it, and what do you notice when it comes to the sumo deadlift high pull?
Yeah. So the way that I look for this and the way that I teach others to look for it is like to watch the elbows. Like the elbow is my tell there. So if the elbow is straight and your arms are extended through that deadlift shrug portion of the movement, then that lets you know that they're on point with timing. If you see those elbows bend at any point prior to that, that identifies an early arm pull. And that's just, there are a couple of other ways, if you look from the side, you can kind of see the space created when they pull early and that sort of deal. But the elbow is a good tell. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're facing, from my experience, if I'm facing them, I look at the elbows. If I'm at the side, I'm looking for that gap between bar and body. And that's always an interesting one, especially once again of that concept of not only what is the fault, but why is it happening? Because a lot of times we as coaches will look, and as they're going through the middle of the movement, we'll see a gap between the bar and the body, and our mind will immediately go to the fact that they're like, hey, they must be pulling the bar out and around. When in reality, the bar is traveling in a straight line, but the reason there's a gap, it's because their butt's still back and their elbows are already bending. So that's a good tell with that one. We still see, and I'll tell you this right now, like we still see the bad setup position. It's like, even if I get somebody ironed out and fixed in the regular deadlift, as soon as the feet go wide and the movement, quote unquote, changes a little bit, there it is. And this is one, because their feet are wider, I think you've got more space to drop your butt even lower. So all of a sudden that same issue is going to occur in the setup position, to where the hips are going to be low and the shoulders going to be behind the bar. Med ball clean. What's the main thing you see go wrong in the dynamic phase of that one?
Lack of hip extension.
Yeah, right. Somebody's not going to stand all the way up. That's the kind of the go-to thing I look for. You're going to see curling, you're going to see that stuff, but that's so much easier to see and not nearly as important as hip extension. Cool. So we've talked through deadlift stuff. What about squats? What do you notice? What is like the static position issue that most people have with the air squat?
Statically, like not moving,
or just in general, what do you see most? Like if we talked about the deadlift, more often than not, somebody starts with their hips too low, right, and their shoulder behind the bar. All else being equal, you got 10 brand new athletes you've never seen before. What do they do wrong with the squat more often than not?
For me, it goes to stance. And you see a number of things, right? Like just not having that awareness of what like shoulder width means, and the fact that it's like your heels underneath your shoulders, the fact that the toes should still naturally be turned out, trying to be like, there's so many things with the foot placement and the actual position of the feet that matter for the squat, that I think, to your point, is just like, can be a wide array of things as you look at a group of athletes squat.
And more often than not, what do they do wrong? Like you say the stance, are they too far in or too far out more often than not?
Oh no, they go narrow.
Yes, right? That's like 80-90% of the time. And then what does that lead to? Like if I don't watch them, like if I don't catch their feet before I call that first rep, but then I see them move, what's the telltale sign, like at the bottom of their squat, that their feet are too narrow?
So you can see that they've shifted. And then you also, like, if you look from the front when they're narrow, you see that kind of like bowing out of the knees, right? Like they're like rolling to the outside of the foot. And that's a tell. Like,
there's not much space to get down there. And then to your point of them rolling forward, it's like the immature squat happens. There's just not enough space for their hips to go down. They have to go back. And the farther the hips go back, because the feet are closer together, the torso is too far forward. It's like as soon as I see somebody with a really immature squat, if I didn't catch it before, I'm like, man, I need to check the stance. If I see somebody that struggles to get to depth, it's like, hey, I need to check the stance, and I also need to check the knees. Because from my experience, outside of people with injuries, even people really deconditioned and things like that, I've not found many people that can't squat to depth if they're in the right stance and if they're doing with their knees what they're supposed to. Now, I have seen people that struggle to have the strength to get back up from that increased range of motion, because a new increased range of motion is a new range of motion, is a weak range of motion. But more often than not, I don't find very many people struggle to get to depth if I get their feet where they need to be and get their knees doing what they need to be. Front squat. We already talked about stance. What's the main thing there? That one's obvious for everybody, right?
Just that rack position. For sure.
And it's, from my experience, it's more of a thing of like, one, as a coach, not putting people in the right position. Hands are too close, which makes the rack position, there's not enough space there. So usually widening the grip a little bit, and then demanding a little bit more from our athletes, asking them to work harder, which is not fun, because I know how much I dislike working hard in the front rack position. When it comes to the overhead squat, what do you see? What's the biggest issue with the, not the stance, knowing that that's probably going to be wrong to begin with, but in the overhead position, what is it?
So this one's interesting, right? Like you say overhead position, right? But I actually find that statically, people can get to a pretty okay position with the ball overhead, but it's dynamically as they move, that shoulder rotates, right? Like, or they the elbow starts to bend. So it's like dynamically for the overhead squat, like not just the setup, but like maintaining that position of the bar while they move.
Yeah, and this is an interesting one, right? I know when I remember when I started CrossFit, like the two go-to cues for the overhead squat was like try to break the bar and then just drive up on the bar. And I remember I would be like, all right, I'm going to break the bar like this and I'm going to drive up as hard as I can. And it's like I immediately go internally rotated and then my shoulders get high, but that's the exact wrong position.
Right.
So instead, if we're going to use break the bar, there needs to be context. Break the bar by turning your pinkies forward and thumbs back will get you externally rotated. Then press up from there is one part. And then the other thing, to your point, it's like when I squat, if I notice that the shoulders are rotating more so, typically that's because you got an athlete with an immature squat. And I think I brought this up on a call yesterday too, of like, when it comes to the overhead squat, there's two unique points of performance that are unique to the overhead squat that aren't needed in the air squat. So it's not back, hips, or line of action, knees, heels, depth, all of that stuff. It's bar path and overhead position, which all incorporate active shoulders and external rotation. And so between overhead position and bar path, there's one that is a must-have and there's one that is a nice-to-have. Which one's the must-have when it comes to an overhead squat? Which one's the nice-to-have?
The bar path, right? Like,
If you don't have the bar path, you're gonna miss the lift, right? So that's the must-have. The nice-to-have is the external rotation and the good overhead position. But here's the deal: if I've got an athlete that doesn't have a very mature squat, meaning they're forward inclined, usually coming from a too narrow of a stance, then I'm going to have to live with that really bad internal rotation as much as I want it externally rotated. If I externally rotate them and their chest is forward, well, the bar is going to come forward and that's going to be a mislift, right? So understanding the concept there too, because I've also seen coaches really dive in to fix that shoulder position. And I'm like, I love that you're that like relentless on this, but unfortunately we got no shot because the squat itself will not lend itself to being able to do that thing well. So
and that ties into something that you were speaking to earlier too, which is just understanding like why it's happening. And so like you said, if you're down here, like pull back, like that's not going to fix that position. Like you need to address that vertical torso to get them into a better position to then ask more of them from that shoulder position. So like, you can't just, can't go off what you see in that regard.
Yeah, dude, love it, man. I think it's cool. It's neat to talk to other people and ask them questions. And it's like, we might go about it in different ways and think through it and see things differently, but the common themes continue to show up time and time again. And so the better we get at understanding points of performance, starting to know what they look like when performed well, how are they going to go wrong, and then start to think through why they potentially are going wrong, the farther along in our coaching journey we're going to get, and the faster you guys, everybody listening, are going to get there than it took me and then it took Larry to get there. So, man, this was a fun conversation, dude. Really enjoyed it. Appreciate you taking the time today, Larry. And we'll have to have you on here again. Yeah.
And I was just gonna say thanks for having me, man, and go Ducks.
Yeah, buddy. Let's see it. I hope they do it, man. It'd be fun to see a new team rather than, even though I live and die with the SEC, I wouldn't mind seeing a little fresh blood since my Gators aren't going to do it. But hopefully we'll have you back on here again soon, man. Thanks, buddy.
All right, buddy. Thank you.
Yep. See you, everyone.